Hello, my name is Matteo and welcome back to this course about Flask user sessions and authentication. In this module, we will implement the current user global variable and create a persistent client-server connection with cookies. Let's see what we need to achieve. We need a global variable that will store the currently logged in user, let's call it current user. This global variable needs to be available inside of all of the views and also inside of all of the templates on the website. To create this, we need to dig a little bit deeper under the surface of the Flask framework. You may be aware that Flask is built on a web application library called Factoid. Factoid is a web server gateway interface library, which means that it creates an interface between the web server, which receives the request, and the application server, which processes them. This application server is what we are actually building in Flask, and the web server is the software which forwards the requests to our application server, like Apache or Nginx. We don't need a web server in the development, but you will definitely need one in production. Application servers like Factoid usually have a so-called pool of threads available, or we can say the collection of threads. Once the request comes in, Factoid will provide a thread from the pool to process it. Thread is the smallest sequence of instructions that can be managed independently. You're probably familiar with them if you ever did some multi-threaded programming. If you're not, don't worry, we won't be working with them directly. Python's standard library allows us to work on multiple threads, but it also has another concurrency concept, the so-called grinlets. Each one of these concepts to multithreading has a concept of thread local data, which means that we can store data in some variable and that data will only be available to a single thread. It won't get mixed up with other data. However, in Factoid, things are not that simple. I told you that a thread gets assigned to each request, but I only did that so we can simplify how the server works. In reality, sometimes a single thread is reused for multiple requests. It all depends on the Factoid's implementation. Developers were aware of this issue, so instead of thread locals, they provided us with their own implementation, Factoid locals. The Factoid local is the place where we can store data and be sure that this data will stay consistent in the lifetime of a single request. Flask builds on top of this context and it provides us with two of its own, which are the application context and request context. Flask will create both of these contexts before processing the request and it will remove them after the request is done. Each context provides us with some globally accessible local variables, which can be referred to as context globals. The four most important context globals are current app, G, request, and session. We are already familiar with some of them, like the session object we use to store the user ID. Now we know how it's created and why it always has the data of the user making the request. Request object holds the information about the incoming request. Without it, we couldn't really do much. Current app is the variable which holds the application instance of the current Flask application. G object stands for global and it's an object made for us so we can use it if we need some temporary storage for a single request lifetime. We will use all of these throughout the course. So you can just imagine that these are global variables which are safe inside of the application context. Now let's try to use this knowledge to implement the current user globally accessible variable.